One very cold evening, 2 or 3 hours perhaps before sundown, I concluded to take a little round in the woods by way of exercise and bring home some fresh venison for supper. So I picked up Sweet Lips, my rifle, and started for a rough broken piece of country where previously I'd always found deer in abundance. But somehow the deer didn't seem to be stirring that evening, and I walked 2 or 3 miles without finding a single one. After going so far, I hated to return without meat, and I kept going, still hoping to find the deer before it got too dark to shoot. But at last I had to give it up and turned my course back toward home again. By this time the sun was setting, and I hurried up as fast as possible to get out of the chaparral and into the prairie before night came on. All the evening I had heard the wolves howling around in an unusual way, but I had no fear of them, as I had been told they seldom if ever attacked a man in Texas. When I had gone back perhaps a half mile or so, a large gray wolf trotted out into the path before me and commenced howling in the most mournful manner, and in an instant he was answered by a dozen other wolves in the hills around us. Thinks I, old fella, if you are hatching a plot for my benefit, I'll make sure of you anyhow. So I brought Sweet Lips to range on his shoulder blade, and at the crack of the gun he gave one spring into the air and dropped as dead as a hammer in his tracks. But somehow, although I can't say I felt any fear of them, my suspicions were aroused as to foul play on the part of the gentlemen, I'll call them anyway, who were answering him from the hills, and I loosened Old Butch in my sheath, and rammed another bullet down Sweet Lips, and as soon as I had done so, I put out for home again in double quick time. But the faster I went, the faster the wolves followed me, and looking back after a little while, I saw 25 or 30 lobos trotting along after me at a rate I knew would soon bring them into close quarters. And in the bushes and chaparral that bordered the trail I was traveling, I could see the gleaming eyes and pointed ears of at least a dozen others coming rapidly toward me. I saw in a minute that they meant mischief, but I knew it was useless to try to beat a wolf in a foot race. However, I resolved to keep on as long as they would let me, and when they closed in, that I would give them the best ready-made fight I had in the shop. So I stepped out as briskly as I could, and the wolves trotted after me, howling in a way that made my hair stand on end, and my very blood run cold. A dozen times I wished myself back again safe in old Virginia, where a man might travel for 100 miles without meeting up with anything more dangerous than a possum. But wishing didn't stop the wolves, so I let out my best licks, hoping that I could make home before they could muster up courage enough to attack me. But I reckoned without my host, for one big fellow, more daring or hungry than the rest, made a rush at me, and I barely had time to level my gun and fire, for he was touching the muzzle of it when I pulled the trigger. He fell dead at my feet, but as if this had been a signal for a general attack, in an instant the whole pack was around me, snarling and snapping, and showing their white teeth in a way that was anything but pleasant. I fought them off with the breech of my gun, for they didn't give me any chance to load it, retreating all the while as rapidly as I could. Once so many of them rushed in upon me at the same time that in spite of all my efforts, I failed to keep them at bay, and they dragged me to the ground. I thought for an instant that it was all up with me, but despair gave me the strength of half a dozen men, and I used Old Butch to such a good purpose that I killed 3 outright and wounded several others, which appeared somewhat to daunt the balance, for they drew off a short distance and began to howl for reinforcements. The reinforcements were on their way, for I could hear them howling in every direction, and I knew that I had no time to lose. So I put off at the top of my speed, and in those days it took a pretty fast Spanish pony to beat me a quarter when I let out the kinks. I let 'em out this time with a will, I tell you, and fairly beat the wolves for a half a mile or so. But my breath then began to fail me, and I could tell by their close, angry yelps that the devils were again closing in upon me. By this time I was so much exhausted that I knew I should make a poor fight of it, more especially as I could perceive, from the number of dark forms behind me, and the gleaming eyes and shining teeth that glistened out of every bush on the wayside, that the wolves had had a considerable addition to their number. It may be thought strange that I didn't take to a tree, but there were no trees there to take to. Nothing but stunted chaparral bushes, not much higher than a man's head. I thought my time had come at last, and I was almost ready to give up in despair, when all at once I remembered seeing, as I came out, a large lone oak tree, with a hollow in it about large enough for a man to crawl into, that grew on the banks of a small cañon not more than 300 or 400 yards from where I then was. I resolved to make one more effort, and if possible, to reach this tree before the wolves came up with me again. And if ever there was good, honest running done without any throw-off about it, I sure did it then. The fact is, I believe a man can't tell how fast he can run until he gets a pack of wolves after him in this way. A fellow will naturally do his best when he knows that if he doesn't, in 20 minutes he'll be parceled out among as many ravenous wolves, a head to one, a leg to another, an arm to a third, and so on. At least, that was the effect it had on me, and I split the air so fast with my nose that it took the skin off of it, and for a week afterward it looked like a peeled onion. However, I beat the wolves once more fairly and squarely, and not much time to spare either, for just as I crawled into the hollow of the tree, which was about as high as my head from the ground, the ravenous creatures were howling all around me. At the bottom of the hollow I found a skunk snugly stowed away, but I soon routed him out, and the wolves gobbled him up in an instant. He left a smell behind him, though, that was anything but agreeable in such close quarters. However, as I was safe there, at any rate, from the attacks of the wolves, and all the smells in the city of New Orleans couldn't have driven me from my hole just at that time. The wolves could only get at me one at a time, and with old Butch in my hand, I knew I could manage 100 in that way. But such howling and yelling I had never heard before or since but once, and that was when I was with the Keechis, and a runner came in and told them that their great chief, Buffalo Hump, had been killed in a fight with the Lipbins. They bit and gnawed and scratched, but it wasn't any use, and every now and then a fellow would jump up and poke his nose into the hollow of the tree, but just as sure as he did it, he caught a wipe across it with old Butch that generally satisfied his curiosity for a while. All night long they kept up their serenade, and, as you may well suppose, I didn't get much sleep. However, the noise didn't matter, for I had gotten several severe bites on my arms and legs, and the pain I suffered from them would have kept me awake anyhow. Just at daylight the next morning the wolves began to sneak off, and when the sun rose, not one was to be seen, except 3 dead ones at the root of the tree that had come in contact with old Butch. I waited a while longer, just to be certain they had all left, and then I crawled out of my den, gave myself a shake, and found I was all right, except a pound or so of flesh taken out of one of my legs, and a few scratches on my arms. I hobbled back home, and for a long time afterward, whenever I heard the howling of wolves, I always felt a little uneasy. I found out the next day why the wolves had attacked me in the way they did. I had a bottle of asafoetida in my trunk, which somehow had gotten broken and run out among my clothes, and when the wolves pitched into me, I had on a coat that had been wet with the confounded stuff, and smelt worse than a polecat. I'd often heard that asafoetida would attract wolves, but I always thought before this that it was a sort of an old woman's yarn. But it's a fact, and if you don't believe it, go some dark night into a thick chaparral, where wolves are numerous, and pour about a gallon over your coat, and then wait a little. See what'll turn up, and if you don't hear howling and snapping and snarling, I'll agree to be stung to death by bumblebees. Bigfoot Wallace.
That night the savages came close enough to camp to fire into it. The next day, General Sully directed his march down the valley of the Beaver. But just as his troops were breaking camp, the long wagon train having already pulled out, and the rear guard of the command having barely got into their saddles, a party of between 200 and 300 warriors who had evidently in some inexplicable manner contrived to conceal themselves until the proper moment, dashed into the deserted camp within a few yards of the rear of the troops and succeeded in cutting off a few led horses and 2 of the cavalrymen who, as is often the case, had lingered a moment behind the column. Fortunately, Captain Smith was riding at the rear of the column and witnessed the attack. Captain Hamilton of the 7th Cavalry was also present. Wheeling to the right about, he at once prepared to charge the Indians and attempt the rescue of the 2 troopers who were being carried off before his very eyes. At the same time, Captain Smith, as representative of the commanding officer of the cavalry, promptly took the responsibility of directing a squadron of the cavalry to wheel out of column and advance in support of Captain Hamilton's guard. With this hastily formed detachment, the Indians, still within pistol range but moving off with their prisoners, were gallantly charged and so closely pressed that they were forced to relinquish one of their prisoners, but not before shooting him through the body and leaving him on the ground, as they supposed, mortally wounded. The troops continued to charge the retreating Indians, upon whom they were gaining, determined, if possible, to effect the rescue of their remaining comrade. They were advancing down one slope while the Indians, just across a ravine, were endeavoring to escape with their prisoner up the opposite ascent, when a peremptory order reached the officers commanding the pursuing force to withdraw their men and reform the column at once. The terrible fate awaiting the unfortunate trooper, carried off by the Indians, spread a deep gloom throughout the command. All were too familiar with the horrid customs of the savages to hope for a moment that the captive would be reserved for aught but a slow, lingering death from tortures the most horrible and painful which bloodthirsty minds could suggest. Such was the truth in his case, as we learnt afterwards when peace was established with the tribes then engaged in war. George Armstrong Custer, 1868.
When we left the woods to cross the Little Big Horn and reach the bluffs on the other side, I was lucky enough to get to my horse. It was a wild rush for the river with the Indians on all sides, yelling like devils, shooting into our ranks and even trying to drag men from their horses. One big Sioux rode alongside of me as we went along at full gallop and tried to pull me from the saddle. He had been shot in the shoulder, and with every jerk he made at me, the blood gushed from his wound and stained my shirt and trousers. He was a determined devil and hung on to me until we almost reached the river. Right at the Little Big Horn, a trooper was shot down in front of me, and Lieutenant Hodson got his first wound. My horse stumbled over Hodson and went over the bluff into the stream, but got to his feet again and carried me across and up the hill. Lieutenant Hodson hung onto the stirrup of Bugler Myers and got over the river and part way up the hill, but received another wound there and was killed. Private James Wilbur.
In 1866, the Crow chief Big Robber and his band of warriors ventured into territory that the Shoshone tribe considered theirs. Both tribes wanted this part of modern-day Wyoming as their hunting grounds. Chief Washakie of the Shoshone thought that it would be better for his people to let the Crows hunt there and let them move on in peace and without bloodshed. As time went by, the Shoshone warriors complained to their chief that the Crows were still there, and they would never leave their land. Chief Washakie sent one of his strongest and most diplomatic warriors and his wife to visit the Crow camp on a mission to request Chief Big Robber and his warriors to leave the area. The Crow chief was furious with the demand. He had the warrior killed in front of his wife and strapped the body to his horse. The wife was then sent home, leading her dead husband. As she rode into camp, the Shoshone went wild with outrage at what had happened. Chief Washakie had his warriors form a war party. As in most tribes, the men were organized into different military societies. This war party were all Chief Washakie's warriors that he had trained and fought with for years. Runners were sent to the Bannocks, and these allies sent some of their warriors to help defeat the Crow threat. The Crow camp was on the Big Wind River, and Big Robber and his warriors were taken by surprise when the Shoshone attacked. The Crows quickly rallied, and the hand-to-hand fighting became a desperate struggle for both sides. Both chiefs were unwilling to yield ground, and the warriors settled into a 5-day battle that involved attacks and counterattacks across the plain. Chief Washakie had seen many of his warriors killed as well as those of his enemy. He rode out and challenged Big Robber to a fight to the death. The loser would take his warriors home and never come back. Chief Washakie taunted Big Robber that he would cut out his heart and eat it. Big Robber, with his honor at stake, accepted the challenge. The two chiefs rode out to the middle of the field of battle. Washakie carried his lance, shield, and a loud rattle that he used to frighten enemy horses. The warriors from both sides stared intently at the distant figures. The horses circled, and then the chiefs clashed and fell to the ground. The men were so far away that none of the warriors could clearly see the outcome. Then Chief Washakie arose alone. He bent down and thrust his knife into the body of Chief Big Robber and cut out his heart. He placed the bloody heart on the end of his lance, gathered his horse, and rode back to his waiting warriors. When Chief Washakie led the victorious war party into camp with his enemy's heart on his lance, the whole tribe came together to celebrate this great event. A huge dance was held, and Chief Washakie proudly displayed his adversary's heart for all to see. According to family history, Washakie didn't eat the heart as he had threatened to do. As the Crows left their camp and moved away, they sent 2 young women on horseback as a gift to Washakie as a show of respect. One of the women, who the Shoshone tribe called Crow Woman, would marry Washakie and become his 4th wife. The couple had 3 children, Charlie, George, and Annie. When George was old enough, he married a girl named Josie. She would eventually care for the aging Chief Washakie, her father-in-law, until he died. He would tell her stories of all the exciting events and battles that happened during his lifetime, including this one, the Battle of Crowheart Butte.